As President of the United States, I was present at the first Pan-American Congress in Washington, D.C. Believe that with God's help, our two countries shall continue to live side by side in peace and prosperity. Benjamin Harrison.
The Voice, the first preserved recording of the man in the White House. The time, like the recording, a curious mix of two eras, of the way things were once done and the way they would be done from now on. The speaker, a man with a foot in both worlds. It was the last of the Gilded Age, a time of extremes of wealth and poverty, backed by the smoke-filled room. But the plains would soon ring out with the voice of the prairie populist, and the seas would bend before a surging American naval power. It was raining, too, the day his grandfather took the same oath, one that would make Benjamin Harrison the 23rd President of the United States. His rival, the ousted and no longer incumbent Grover Cleveland, politely held an umbrella over his head as Benjamin Harrison prepared to give his inaugural address. "I do not," Harrison said, "mistrust the future."
Harrison is very much aware of these times that are changing, that are going to lead to a very different America.
The president who starts to bring America, perhaps slowly, but onto the world stage as a power that is going to be extending.
Politics was, in some ways, it was a contact sport.
It's about winning, winning, winning.
Does he not understand how many men came so close to the penitentiary to get him elected?
He was not a glad-hander.
One senator said it was like talking to a hitching post.
I think that is one of the things about Harrison that continues to make him a mystery to most.
But on the inside, there's a fire that burns.
And he would take both fists and make his points like this.
Violence in the Reconstruction South means murder.
Harrison made a vow that he would not purchase the presidency by a compact of silence on the voting rights issue.
Harrison certainly pushed it further than it had ever gone before.
In his refusal to sort of simply cave to party bosses, I think he struck a blow for independence of the executive.
You can make enemies.
And it's just extraordinary when you look at his record and his emphasis on doing what was right in the right way, even at significant personal cost.
I think it is time to rethink the place of Benjamin Harrison in the evolution of the presidency.
A President at the Crossroads is made possible through a generous grant from the Indiana Office of Tourism Development.
North Bend, Ohio, sometime after 1833. Benjamin Harrison was born in this place, in that year. A farmer's son schooled in a log cabin. But today, it's the family orchard that will teach him a lesson that will shape all the days of his life.
I remember pressing through an alder thicket. I saw sitting in the midst a colored man with the frightened look of a fugitive, attempting to satisfy his hunger with some walnuts. He noticed my approach with a fierce, startled look to see whether I was likely to betray him. I was frightened myself and left him in some trepidation, but I kept his secret. This is Christmas Eve.
Some 2 decades later, the boy is now a man, 500 miles away from his home and his family.
And the dear little ones are nestling their little heads on the pillow, filled with high expectations of what Santa Claus will bring them. And Papa is not there.
He was now in the thick of the Atlanta campaign, designed by the armies of the North to strike a death blow to the Civil War that has pit brother against brother, and to bring freedom to slaves like the one whose secret he once held so close. That he was there at all was unexpected. Benjamin Harrison was now living in Indianapolis and had become a protege of the state's governor, Oliver P. Morton. a man who likes to keep his friends close. Close, too, is Morton with President Abraham Lincoln, and the president has called for more troops. When his state's response proves lukewarm, Morton decides to put some heat to it. He asks Harrison to help recruit volunteers, but cautions that as Indiana court reporter, he is too valuable to go himself. It is not likely that he will. Harrison and his wife Caroline are still reeling from the death of a baby girl, their third child. Torn between family and duty, he makes a decision.
Harrison's feeling is, I can't recruit other soldiers or other men to go serve in the field without going myself.
I'm proud to be the wife of Benjamin Harrison the lawyer. I shall be prouder still to be the wife of Harrison the soldier. Don't worry about me. I can take care of myself and the children. Caroline Harrison.
For over a year, an inexperienced Colonel Harrison and his equally inexperienced 70th Indiana Regiment roam the Kentucky countryside, protecting rail lines. At night, Harrison studies tactics. By day, he drills his volunteers. Many of them chafe under his strict discipline. They nickname the 5'6" Harrison Little Ben.
He couldn't dominate people by his physical presence, but he did have the power of his office. He was the leader of his regiment, and he never forgot that, and he never compromised on that.
Still, there are times when Harrison feels completely isolated.
General Payne gave a party, though frequently urged to dance, especially by a very buxom and pretty wife of one of our surgeons. I persistently declined. I have lost all faculty of making myself agreeable in general society.
When war finally comes to the 70th Indiana, they're ready. At Resaca, Georgia, Harrison and his men capture a battery of 4 cannon, fighting through devastating sniper fire, which is, as Harrison later writes, provokingly accurate.
For an hour and a half, the enemy's shells and grapes fell like hail. 2 of my men had their heads torn off, close down to the shoulder.
He's very open with her throughout the letters, not only about what they're doing, but also how he feels that what his duty is and how God has influenced his participation in the war. Sometimes all of that comes within the same letter.
Our surgeons got separated from us. I stripped my arms to dress the men's wounds myself. I pulled out of one poor fellow's arm a splinter 5 inches long and as thick as my 3 fingers.
In one occasion, he writes the farewell letter, just in case something happens, here's my brief note, and at the bottom of the page, well, okay, so what happened yesterday was, so he manages to get through.
At Peachtree Creek, Harrison acts on his own to close a gap in the Union lines.
Harrison put his spurs to his horse and dashed up the hill in front of his brigade. They, cheering, followed rapidly up the hill. L.T. Miller.
By God, Harrison, I'll make you a brigadier general for this fight. General Fighting Joe Hooker.
So on January 23, 1865, President Lincoln nominates Harrison for the rank of brigadier general. 4 months later, Lincoln is felled by an assassin's bullet.
You know, Carrie, that I am pretty ugly sometimes, and have often made you unhappy, for all of which I am very penitent. But when the Civil War is over, I think we shall live very lovingly together, provided you don't keep too many canaries, mockingbirds, and cats. With a heart immensely full of love for you, my dear chosen one, your husband.
Born Caroline Lavinia Scott, she was proof that opposites attract. When he was 15, Benjamin left North Bend to enroll at Farmers College in Cincinnati. It was there that he met John W. Scott, a professor, and his daughter, the one with the dancing brown eyes.
And he did find reasons to go to Professor Scott's home on a frequent basis, and really took a shine to this to this young woman who was just the opposite of him in personality.
When John Scott decided to move back to Oxford and take his daughter with him, Benjamin transferred to Miami University, which just happened to also be in Oxford. There, he studied ethics and literature and pledged Phi Delta Theta fraternity as one of its earliest members. But his interest soon focused on law and religion. With either career, the young Harrison reasoned one could serve mankind well. After all, a devout Presbyterian faith devoted to service had been a cornerstone of his life since childhood.
His mother was very, very influential in teaching him a religious faith. His mother died when he was in college. This was a real blow to young Ben Harrison, and it was in college that he made his commitment to Christ.
When he was courting his wife, all his college friends called him the pious moonlight dude.
Apparently, piety and passion did mix, for the dude had won Caroline's heart. Yet Harrison was concerned. He felt that her many duties at the school were taking a toll on her fragile health. His solution? Ben proposed.
And he said, we've really got to do this, because I'm going to save you.
My present design is to migrate to Chicago in the spring, where I will be able to obtain immediate admission to the bar. An energetic and patient pursuit of my profession will ensure success. In a word, I pledge my best efforts for her happiness.
Benjamin, if you conclude to settle in Indianapolis, you may very soon get into a good practice. Most of the members of the bar here are moral, and some of them pious men, but none of them are very talented. Your cousin, William Sheets.
Of such casual remarks are weighty decisions made. With her father presiding, Carrie and Ben tied the knot. They shipped everything they owned in a single box for 91 cents and relocated to the Hoosier capital. Both were just 20 years old. Harrison's legal career, though, while energetic as promised, required more patience than expected.
Yeah, he is struggling. He was allowed to assist the county prosecutor in a burglary case, and he got the chance to give the summary argument.
He had written out an elaborate summation that he was going to make to the jury, but poor lighting in the courtroom meant that he couldn't actually see what he had written.
Of such serendipitous moments our careers also made, for Harrison won the case. From then on, he would speak from the heart and the head, but not a written text. In September 1868, a young boy herding cows along the White River spotted a man and a woman resting by a fire along the water's edge. Turns out they weren't river gazing at all.
His head was half blown off by a shotgun. His wife's body was burned from the waist down, probably from the flash from the pistol shot she took to the head. These were outwardly respectable middle-class people. They weren't the kind of people who were supposed to end up dead.
As the funeral procession passed, a grocer's wife stood in curious observance. When asked why, Nancy Clem replied, "No reason. She didn't know them." But she did know them, for Jacob and Nancy Jane Young were her partners in a loan sharking scheme. She also knew the man who was now one of the nation's up-and-coming attorneys and who would prosecute her for their murder. Turns out he was her neighbor, Benjamin Harrison. The trial was a national sensation. Some 250 witnesses. Harrison shreds alibi after alibi. He turns his emotional pleas on and off at will, saving his most impassioned speech to denounce Nancy Clem persuading her 15-year-old niece to commit perjury.
And he said, "I would rather walk behind my child's coffin than have my child's eternal soul threatened by presenting these awful lies."
Nancy Clem was convicted, but she appealed, and appealed, and appealed again. She escaped the gallows, but served 4 years on a perjury conviction. But for Benjamin Harrison, his skills as a cool tactician had been affirmed, and he would need that cool to deal with personal tragedy. In 1878, Harrison's father died in his sleep. In the Gilded Age, grave robbing and cadaver dissecting often went hand in hand, so the family built a secure brick vault and hired a watchman. But on the day of the funeral, it was discovered that an adjoining plot had been disturbed. An investigation led Harrison's brother John to the Ohio Medical College, and there he discovered a hooded body hanging from a rope beneath a trap door. To his astonishment, when the hood came off, its father! Upon hearing the news, it was noted that this was possibly the only time Benjamin Harrison uttered a profanity.
Oh, what's the matter with Harrison? He's all right. There can be no comparison. He's all right. Ben's a man who bravely went for his native...
It is 1888, and the man who once was one of the country's premier attorneys is now its preeminent Republican, heading his party's ticket for president. Benjamin Harrison's nomination is no surprise, but it is a compromise. The nominee 4 years earlier, and the presumptive favorite, James G. Blaine, had withdrawn his name from consideration. Or had he?
You really can't talk about Harrison without talking about James G. Blaine. James G. Blaine was the dominant political figure in the Republican Party of that era. He wanted desperately to be President of the United States.
Also always scheming. And so you could never tell what his motivation was.
Blaine himself, in his heart of hearts, really wanted the convention to come to him. Blaine's men said, let's give our votes to X candidate for a while and show that he's not strong enough to win. And then let's give our votes to Y candidate for a while and show that he's not strong enough. And then we'll have, oh my gosh, a deadlocked convention. Who can help us break this deadlock? None other than James G. Blaine. Well, the first person they chose for that dubious honor of the strategy was Benjamin Harrison.
This was Harrison's third foray into elected office. In many ways, his doing so was inevitable.
Benjamin Harrison comes from a distinguished American political family. His great-grandfather, Benjamin Harrison, same name, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a governor of Virginia. His grandfather was William Henry Harrison.
William Henry Harrison was a battlefield legend. He had served his country with valor in the War of 1812. As Indiana Territorial Governor, he removed the Native American enclave of Prophetstown and pursued its charismatic founder, Tecumseh, into Canada to take away both his dreams of a united Indian Confederacy and his life. As old Tippecanoe, he parlayed that military fame to become the 9th President of the United States. But his time in office was short-lived. Washington, D.C. dumped its sewage in a marsh just blocks from its water supply. William Henry Harrison died of sepsis just 1 month into his term. Benjamin Harrison was only 7 years old at the time, but comparisons to his grandfather would follow him the rest of his political life.
Harrison was really reluctant to piggyback on his grandfather's success and said, I'm not the grandson of anyone.
But if Harrison was distancing himself from his lineage, he could not escape his destiny. His old ally, now Senator Oliver P. Morton, had grown to see his increasing popularity as a threat, and Harrison's political career was stalled. Then, fate stepped in the form of the 1876 Republican nominee for governor. Godliff Orth had stepped down. A newspaper accused Orth of shaking down investors in Venezuelan bonds while he was in Congress, and Harrison was asked to replace him. He is introduced as Young Tip.
Republican parades featured veterans of Tippecanoe, veterans of his grandfathers who had voted for his grandfather. But those same parades also featured images, banners about the Hamburg massacre in the summer of 1876 in South Carolina. During a July 4th parade, there had been a conflict in the street between African Americans who were parading and whites. And Republicans featured this in 1876 to try and remind Northern voters that the gains of the Civil War were in danger of being erased.
Harrison's opponent in the race is Democrat James D. Blue Jeans Williams. Williams was a politician and farmer, and wore his blue denims to political rallies and speeches, although as he grew more prosperous, he was known to line the inside of his jeans with silk. Harrison's own past was as rural could be, growing up on a farm that was never prosperous, and a father who risked financial ruin to send him to college. Like Williams, he had put those days behind him. But for the partisan press, his prosperity is fodder for the attack.
He's accused of being a kid glove aristocrat when he starts running for office in his own right.
Harrison dresses in Broadway fashion, with his hair parted in the middle and his beard trimmed like a row of tree box. The New York Sentinel.
The rural gambit works, but just barely. Williams ekes out a 5,000-vote win out of over 400,000 ballots cast. The Republican press wonders if Williams' family will attend his inaugural ball barefoot. But Harrison has bigger political fish to fry. In 1880, the death of Oliver Morton leaves a vacancy in the United States Senate, and Harrison is appointed by the state legislature. He advocates for a protective tariff and using the money raised for infrastructure spending, education for the children of freed slaves, and supporting the heroes who saved the Union. But to the Democrats, Union veterans equal Republican votes. President Cleveland earns the title of veto king. Over half the 400 bills he turns down are for pensions, and Harrison calls each veto tipped with poisoned arrows. But after one term, Harrison is out. Democrats have retaken control of the state legislature. He bitterly blames his loss on gerrymandering.
Benjamin Harrison did get smacked down from time to time. Like most politicians, he won and he lost. And he lost several times. The environment in which he rose to power was a very challenging, very competitive, very difficult environment.
Back at the Republican convention, Blaine has been outmaneuvered by Harrison's political team, which includes former Indiana Attorney General Louis Michener and John Wanamaker, a merchant considered to be a pioneer in the new field of marketing. Harrison wins on the 8th ballot to take on incumbent Grover Cleveland.
He was in his law office in Indianapolis. Michener sent him a telegram that said, "You are put in command." And Harrison nearly fainted. He went home up North Delaware Street to tell his wife, Caroline, that he had won the nomination. And before he got there, he realized she knows, because there was a huge crowd out front of his house taking off chunks of the picket fence.
For his running mate, Harrison chooses New Yorker Levi P. Morton. Harrison will need the Empire State if he's to win in a country with very well-defined battle lines.
A solid South versus a almost solid Republican North. And in the two doubtful states that were most important, New York and Indiana, that's where the real nitty-gritty fighting went on.
The Democrats have designated Grover Cleveland as a child of destiny. The Herald wishes to warn its Democratic friends that we have a greater claim. The scriptural significance of the word Benjamin is the chosen one. Levi, the elect. We don't believe the democracy will have the temerity to go back on the scriptures. Indianapolis Herald.
This was party politics with an emphasis on party. Polling places were the site of parades and picnics with a shot of whiskey thrown in. There was passion, too, as voter turnout nationally hovered around 80%. You didn't need to know how to read to vote. You were just provided with a colored ballot and dropped it into a box. As for the campaign itself, less was more.
At that time, presidential candidates really didn't go out on the stump and barnstorm around the country. That wasn't seen as dignified.
It's called the front porch campaign. He doesn't have to go anywhere. They come to him, and he speaks to them. They took specific groups to come to see him. He might talk to them about a particular issue that they were interested in.
He had his own stenographer take down what he said, Then you give it to the wire services. This is a major step in the creation of modern campaigning.
And what better place than the Crossroads of America to bring people together than Indianapolis? And I think that's the real genius behind it.
Later on, speeches and welcoming ceremonies were organized at University Park in Indianapolis.
They had over 300,000 people come and listen to Benjamin Harrison, over 80 speeches, starting right here from their front door.
Caroline participated in the campaign, putting people up at night, dignitaries coming to town. Things got pretty tattered, let's say, in the house.
They're surrounding the house, they're trampling the grass, they take pickets from the fence as souvenirs.
It's the White House or the poorhouse for us. Caroline Harrison.
The big issue in the 1880 election was the tariff. The Democrats wanted the tariff lowered to the lowest level possible, sort of moving toward free trade.
This was pure gold for the Republican campaigners. They said basically what you would have if you took Grover Cleveland's ideas is that you'd have people out of work, we'd have people's wages pushed down to the level of the pauper labor of Europe and that kind of thing. And that resonated with people. And Harrison hammered on that over and over again in the campaign.
I pity the man who wants a coat so cheap that the man or woman who produces the cloth or shapes it into a garment will starve in the process.
But what would a Gilded Age campaign be without a little mudslinging? And for Cleveland's people, what better club to use than some grandfathering?
His grandfather's hat is too big for his head, but Ben tries it on just the same. But it don't fit even a little bit on Benjamin Harrison's brain.
Not to be outdone, partisan tunesmiths reached way back, calling Cleveland a coward and a Southern sympathizer, and dredging up an old paternity suit.
Ben left his home, his wife and child, to serve up in the battleground, while Grover Cleveland stayed behind to sow his wild oats all around. So what's the matter with Harrison? He's all right.
9 different parties were represented on the ballot, including the Equal Rights Party. Belva Lockwood, their nominee, was the first woman to run, not as an independent, but at the top of a party ticket. Women could run, but they could not vote. As the election drew near, it was Harrison's home state that could be the making or breaking point.
It was a great scandal in 1888 because one of the Republican leaders, a man named Dudley from Indiana, sent a letter, perhaps real, to the Republican workers in Indiana telling them to divide the floaters, those who were maybe not going to vote Republican or vote at all, divide the floaters into blocks of 5 and then assign one leader over that block to make sure that they voted, that they got their money for voting for Harrison, and that they did in fact vote for Harrison.
Harrison made no excuses for Dudley. In fact, he never spoke to him again.
He waited up, and everyone was getting nervous and frantic and looking at all the results. He waited for Indiana to come in. He said, I have my native state, and then he went to bed. And he said, well, I figured if I were president, I would need a good night's sleep, and if I weren't, then what did it matter?
When the dust settled, the North-South split played out exactly as expected. But the swing states all broke Harrison's way. He took the Electoral College 238 to 168. He won New York. He won Indiana. Ironically, he did not win his home city of Indianapolis.
When Harrison gets elected, he thanks Divine Providence. He is grateful to Divine Providence for his election.
Does he not understand how many men came close to the penitentiary to get him elected? Matthew Quay.
At one moment, as he's about to head for the train station with his family, he went into his library and looked around and just sort of tears welled up in his eyes, and he was sort of overcome by the moment, wondering whether he would ever come back, wondering what lay ahead.
To the music of the Marine Corps Band conducted by John Philip Sousa, President Harrison descended the long stairway into the inaugural ball as his country's centennial president. taking office 100 years after George Washington. The new century brought with it a new agenda. Harrison quietly begins to set in motion a vision for the country that he'd been developing since his time as a senator. He had the tools. Both houses of Congress were in Republican hands. He had a powerful ally, Speaker of the House Thomas Reed, who often created his own procedural rules and was called a czar. And he had the funds. The government was running a surplus. But hold on, said the powers that be. First, the president had to deal with the spoils of war.
Party patronage is really important. People who work for the election of members of a party, they expect to be repaid with jobs.
People would wait outside the president's office in lines by the hundreds looking for jobs.
A form letter merely to be signed. Dear Sir, I appreciate the kindly feeling of Senator Quay and his colleagues of the Pennsylvania delegation. In the event of my election to the presidency, I shall regard the state of Pennsylvania as entitled to representation in my cabinet. Very truly yours.
And Harrison's response to this impertinent request?
I said no.
I think we have too many people in politics who are good at talking to people in small groups. We need people who are bad at that, and he had that gift.
George Hoare, Republican from Massachusetts, refused to name which Western senator said this. If Harrison were to address an audience of 10,000 men, he would capture them all. But if each one of them were presented to him in private, he would make him his enemy.
I do sometimes feel like a hunted animal as my walks and drives and even my meals are taken with those who are wanting something.
Patronage was not the only burdensome custom of the day's politics. A turn-of-the-century president was obliged to defer to Congress, but Harrison finds that unacceptable.
I think Harrison's attempts to woo members of Congress is relatively new at this time.
He didn't sit back and, let people in Congress dictate matters. He was pushing, always pushing.
Persuasion often took the form of dinners at the White House. The kitchen served up meals with green turtle soup or roast duck, while the president offered a dish of arm twisting as dessert. He wanted action on the legislation that Grover Cleveland had been so willing to lay to waste with his veto pen.
The 1890 Pension Act enables elderly veterans, widows, mothers with no male breadwinner, who had a son in the Union Army, children whose fathers have died, to live without being reduced to pauperism. You can say that the Harrison administration made great strides in creating kind of safety net that we take for granted today.
But if Democrats balked at what they saw were attempts to buy a lifelong Republican coalition, they dug in over the issue of trade. Harrison promised high wages. They saw higher prices. Without a single Democratic vote, Reed wrangles a bill sponsored by Ohio Representative William McKinley through the House.
The McKinley tariff raised rates quite high, lowered some, but it also included a provision for what was called reciprocity. That is, it empowered the president to negotiate with foreign powers for trade deals that would essentially open up markets primarily in Latin America for American farm products.
Congress becomes a high-stakes chess match. Some causes will win, some will fall. But this is chess with a wild card. To find it, one only needs to look to the West, and an issue obscure to us today that brought about a fiery debate. 6 states have joined the Union: Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, the most during any administration, and something that Harrison had argued for as far back as his days as chairman of the Senate Committee on Territories. Mostly agrarian states and several with rich lodes of silver, they support coinage of the metal to bring bounty to miners and relief to the farm community.
Creditors in the United States wanted the money supply to be relatively small because every dollar they had or were owed would be worth more. Farmers in the West who had overextended themselves, were deeply in debt, saw silver as a way of lifting some of their debt burden.
Next, there are those who fear that with explosive economic growth in railroads and steel, too much power now rests with the consolidation of business. A new word finds its way into the American vocabulary: trusts. And there is Harrison himself, and an issue that is never far from his mind.
The colored people did not intrude themselves upon us. They were brought here in chains. They are now free. When and under what conditions is the black man to have a free ballot? When is he, in fact, to have those full civil rights which have so long been his in law?
I think that in many ways we can look at Harrison as someone who is making the point that the United States is a multi-ethnic nation, right? That these people are citizens. Black folks in the South are citizens just as much as white Southerners are, and there's certain rights that they are entitled to. And I think that's a powerful statement, especially coming at this time.
The debate cools, the votes readied. For consideration by the 51st Congress, Ohio Senator John Sherman's Silver Purchase Act, in which the government buys 4.5 million ounces of silver each month, which could in turn be redeemed in certificates for silver or for gold. The Antitrust Act, also named after its sponsor John Sherman, seeks to punish conduct which unfairly tends to destroy competition itself. But an impasse seems to be brewing over New Hampshire Senator Henry Blair's education bill.
It was pretty innovative for the time, right? Harrison supports this bill that would have provided federal funding to the states, specifically to put towards education, especially literacy. And there's a lot of opposition towards this. The bill essentially would have been applied to everyone. Black folks in the South, they're working hard to escape the legacy of slavery in an era when reading is criminal for many of them.
And the federal elections bill, co-sponsored by Massachusetts Henry Cabot Lodge and George Hoare, appears headed for rough waters.
What the 1890 election bill does is provide for federal supervision of congressional elections.
The Democrats portrayed it as what they called a force bill, meaning you're going to use federal authority to force the South to allow black people to vote.
Speaker Reed was able to get the Lodge bill through the House of Representatives. It was a narrow vote, but he got it through. Then it went to the Senate, where the tariff bill, the McKinley bill, was still pending. It became sort of a showdown.
But Harrison's window of opportunity has closed. In the midterms, Democrats retake control of Congress.
The Democrats were never going to let something like this pass. It was, their political power was geared upon suppressing the African American vote in the South.
They came back, it didn't happen, sleight of hand, and it never got passed.
The Silver Purchase, pension, and antitrust bills all pass. The Lodge and Blair bills do not.
And so the backlash to the Lodge bill was far more important than the effort itself, because it caused white Southerners to redouble their efforts to exclude African Americans from the political process. This is when lynching was at its peak in the United States, something that Harrison abhorred and denounced, but seemed powerless to stop.
Stymied by a hostile Congress, Harrison looks for ways where he can act unilaterally. It seems the country's affairs of state are a wide-open arena for him. It's true he named James G. Blaine as his Secretary of State, but the plumed knight, as he is called, often reports that he is too ill to handle most matters that are on his plate. Or, once again, is he? Rumor has it that Blaine can't stand the heat of the Washington, D.C. summer, and whenever possible, he retreats to the coolness of his home state, Maine. Of the other members of his cabinet, Harrison is closest to Benjamin Tracy, the Secretary of the Navy. That bond was strengthened by a tragedy that befell Tracy in February of 1890.
His house burned down in Washington, and Harrison rushed to the scene, helped administer artificial respiration to resuscitate him, and he also had the very grim duty of telling Tracy that his wife and daughter had died.
Where they were like-minded was in the advancement of American interests. For Harrison, it was through promoting American products. For Tracy, to protect commerce, it was in revitalizing the American fleet, which had fallen from the most powerful in the world during the Civil War to a remnant.
A mighty roar from 15,000 throats rent the air, and the big warship glided from the ways of the cramped shipyard. Her battery of 13 and 8-inch guns is one of the most powerful batteries provided for a United States ship. The Illustrated American.
Congress authorized the building of 3 battleships for a Navy that had none. With the beginnings of a fleet that could patrol 2 oceans, Harrison proved that he would not be afraid to use it.
It was the USS Baltimore that was docked in Chile, and some American sailors took shore leave, and there was a big fight, and American sailors were killed. In fact, there were some rumors that local police were involved in this melee and had actually killed some of the American sailors.
Harrison demanded reparations.
The Chilean government stubbornly refused, and Harrison was ready to send a fleet down to Chile.
But cooler heads prevailed. There was no war. Still, with Blaine a consistent no-show, Harrison turns his skills as a negotiator to the world stage. He reopens the European market to American pork after fears of disease had closed it. He settled a controversy between the U.S., Britain, and Canada concerning harvesting the seal population of the Pribilof Islands, issuing the first presidential order to protect an individual species. And at Blaine's urging, he convened a 6-week tour of American factories by delegations from Latin America, and he favored building a transatlantic canal through Nicaragua.
Harrison was a visionary about those questions, and I don't think all presidents would have bought into them.
Now approaching 60, Harrison seemed to be everywhere at once. He personally appeared to open infrastructure projects across the country. He remains true to his goal of advancing African American prestige by naming Frederick Douglass ambassador to Haiti. He was the first to use the railroads to travel to the West Coast, covering 10,000 miles and giving 140 speeches in a month. He saw a West that was rapidly changing character. The last serious confrontation between the United States and the Indian tribes, a massacre at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, occurred during Harrison's presidency. He cleaned house at the Indian Agency, acknowledging that cuts in rations and delays in following through on treaty obligations were at fault. And he slipped a provision into a Land Revision Act that few congressmen actually read, but which gave him tremendous power.
He put more than 30 million acres of forest under protection as a national forest, the precursor to our national forest system we have today.
Yet no amount of collaboration, passive or otherwise, could smooth over the growing rift between Harrison and his Secretary of State, exacerbated by Harrison's refusal to make Blaine's son, Walker, the Assistant Secretary of State.
Mrs. Blaine never got over this, and neither did her husband. Mrs. Blaine, in her private letters, mocked Caroline Harrison, referred to her as her American Majesty. In essence, the Blaines thought, you know, those Hoosiers down at the White House, they are sitting in our seats.
The White House that Caroline Harrison inherited was hardly a palace fit for a queen, let alone a first family.
The rats have nearly taken the building, so it has become necessary to get a man with ferrets. They have become so numerous and bold they get up on the table in the upper hall, and one got up on Mr. Halford's bed. Caroline Harrison.
It was vermin-infested, not really decent living quarters.
She ordered it all to be scrubbed and cleaned to try to bring up levels of sanitation, both for the family and for the people that were working there.
And did significant renovations to the rooms, and again, really worked to beautify the White House.
Another thing that we do not do today typically, that very much was a habit in the 19th century, is clipping off pieces of the curtains. It was the people's house, they roamed around, there wasn't the level of security that there is now.
An intruder breaks into the White House, and so Benjamin Harrison comes downstairs, and there's these 2 guards trying to subdue this intruder, and Benjamin Harrison assists, gets the guy, ties him up with a curtain cord, and turns to the guard and says, "Is there anything more that you require from me?"
But if you're going to build a more secure and more user-friendly place to call home, the First Lady thought, do it with style.
It looks sort of like Versailles. Everything's covered in glass. You've got palms and statues in every which place. There are all these little markings saying we're going to put a palm tree here and we're going to put a statue here. It's almost something you'd find in like a luxury hotel.
But Caroline's vision was prevented by the politics of the time. Seems as though Harrison's traditional ally, Speaker Reed, was miffed over lack of patronage and never brought it to a vote.
She was allotted $30,000 by Congress to make a major overhaul of the White House and did significant renovations to the rooms, really worked to beautify the White House, to really show it at its best.
He's the first one to put electricity in the White House. He and his wife would not touch the switches. They were afraid of handling the electricity.
Caroline called in a photographer to give the public a first glimpse inside the new White House, Francis Benjamin Johnston. Not surprising, for Caroline Harrison, within the bounds of her influence as First Lady, helped advance women's issues.
Carolyn Harrison, for example, used her reputation to help ensure that women would be admitted to Johns Hopkins to study medicine. She was the first First Lady to give public address of her own remarks. She was the first Lady to have a public art exhibition. She was recognized as an expert china painter. She collected the White House china from many generations of presidents.
As a concession to a more habitable living space, the president himself turned his office into a parlor. After all, the White House was getting a little cramped. At any given time, Caroline's father and the children and grandchildren could take up residence. It was also home to her widowed niece, Mary Lord Dimmock, who was called Mame.
She even was granted access to the official code. Sometimes she would decode foreign policy documents to help the president.
You ought to feel very much flattered at how your Uncle Ben thinks of you. Elizabeth Lord.
The media darling of the household is the president's grandson, Benjamin Harrison McKee. The press calls him Baby McKee, the White House pet. It's a colorful time in the Harrison household. Benjamin and Caroline ran herd on a virtual Noah's Ark. Caroline's dog, Dash, several cats, 2 possums gifted to the president named Mr. Protection and Mr. Reciprocity, and a goat named Mr. Whiskers, who often pulled Baby McKee around in a cart.
Without warning, the goat started down Executive Avenue on a brisk canter. At the foot of the descent was an excavation where workmen had been repairing the street. The president saw this. His coattails shot straight out behind. The Arkansas Daily Traveler.
He was wheezing like a porpoise. The president, by a brilliant coup, caught the bridle of the fleet-footed goat just before the excavation was reached. General Harrison displayed better running qualities than he did at the polls. The Washington Star.
It is now 1892, and if James G. Blaine is hemming and hawing about running against his boss for the Republican nomination, it must be an election year. Mere weeks before the convention, he resigns as Secretary of State. But Harrison's men are too savvy in the ways of the party apparatus. The contingent known as Blaneiacs is stymied and Harrison is renominated. It will be an uphill climb to keep the White House. For its expansive vision, the 51st Congress gets the nickname the $1 Billion Congress. But therein lies a problem.
The 1890 Pension Act opens the floodgates. The Harrison administration will begin with a Treasury surplus that's going to just disappear. And by the turn of the 1900s, pensions are a third of the federal budget.
Pensions are granted for any reason. One mother gets funds based on a son who fell off his horse and drowned in a river while deserting. Another elderly wife gets money based on a husband who fell off a ladder.
A lot of young girls ran out to marry these guys who were maybe 60 years old, knowing that someday they would get their pension. Someday soon they would get their pension.
The Republicans are a victim of their own success. They get the pension law, they get the tariff law, they get the Silver Purchase Act, they get the Antitrust Act. They put a lot of measures through. And so there's a lot to criticize.
What we see coming to a head in 1892 is a consequence of the growing inequality of income in the United States. And laborers said, hey, how come we're not getting our fair share? Farmers were in bad shape economically. They succeeded too well in what they did. With mechanization and further land coming under cultivation, they were producing too much and the prices collapsed.
Economic unrest leads to strikes at Carnegie Steel and the Coeur d'Alene silver mines, leading to violence. And a new populist movement is springing up out west to challenge the two-party establishment.
It's clearly not a very well-distributed national growth. You start to see by the late 1880s newspaper stories about the Senate and as a millionaires club. So, they have a very strong message that the Republican Party is a protector of business interests as opposed to working class interests, and doesn't bode well for Harrison in the White House.
Harrison's Democratic rival is once again Grover Cleveland. But Harrison has no heart for the struggle. Caroline is deathly ill with tuberculosis. A planned trip to the Adirondacks has not worked to restore her failing health.
Every morning, for weeks past, a lone and solitary man has been walking in the garden overlooking the Potomac. The president, slowly and with eyes cast down, once-a-week newspaper.
Caroline Harrison dies in the White House just 2 weeks before the election. Out of respect, Cleveland does no campaigning.
What tipped Harrison's way in '88 tipped Cleveland's way in '92, and Harrison lost. He did not carry Indiana. He did not carry New York. He did not carry Illinois. He did not carry Wisconsin.
He might no longer be the incumbent, but Harrison is still an expansionist. Seeking a fueling station in Pearl Harbor, he tacitly accepts the overthrow of the monarchy in Hawaii and urges Congress to annex the islands.
It's the world in which he lived, right? I mean, I think that that's what powerful nations in the period are doing. They are not sort of staying at home, they are expanding. I think a lot of it's commerce, but I don't think that that can be separated away from this idea of American influence. America can bring something different to some of these places.
It is Harrison's last act as president, one that Grover Cleveland and his philosophy of small government quickly put to an end. In March 1893, Benjamin Harrison returned to his house on Delaware Street alone. His first day back, he put flowers on Caroline's grave.
It is fearfully lonesome in this empty house. I have not gotten into visiting habits, and it is very rare that anyone comes in.
Harrison was determined to reinvigorate his law practice. Needless to say, as an ex-president, he could command very high fees, and he did. He had prosperity, he had his family, but there was still something missing, and that was true love.
Before long, everyone noticed the inordinate number of carriage rides that the general was taking with a certain someone. He had reconnected with Mame, Caroline's niece. Over the next 4 years, their relationship blossomed, and with Benjamin Tracy serving as best man, they married. He was 62, she 37.
Russell, the son, and Mary, the daughter, were quite appalled by this. Somehow it was a travesty against their mother.
A year later, daughter Elizabeth was born. Comfortable at last in his twilight years, Harrison writes a book, This Country of Ours, and gives a series of lectures at Stanford University. He takes Mame and Elizabeth with him to Paris as he represents Venezuela in a dispute with British Guiana, showing remarkable endurance, arguing for 25 hours in court. But then, surprising feats of endurance seemed to be standard operating procedure for General Harrison.
He was taking his evening stroll near his home on Delaware Street when one of his neighbors burst out of her home and saying that 2 men who were hurrying down the street had just robbed her home. And Harrison took off after the men, yelling at them to stop and cease and desist. And Harrison himself nabbed one of the robbers.
In February 1901, his legendary resilience left him. Harrison came down with influenza, which soon worsened into pneumonia. At 4:45 in the afternoon of March 13th, he passed away at home in a room filled with relatives and members of his administration. His doctor held his left hand, checking for a pulse. Mame held his right. Neither his son Russell nor his daughter Mary made it back in time. The 70th Indiana marched with their general one final time, circling Monument Circle in Indianapolis before proceeding out to Crown Hill Cemetery and into history.
I think Harrison's administration really deserves re-examination and a rethinking and a questioning about where he really fits in the evolution of the presidency. $1 billion Congress, the 51st Congress, passed a record number of public laws. It was a kind of standout administration.
You think about the fact that a president in the late 19th century is advocating actively for African American voting rights in his inaugural address. That's surprising. You also think about him calling for and signing the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's not what you would expect.
One of the things that surprised me the most is that people don't talk about him more. He's someone who is doing things that aren't necessarily popular, but that I think we could look at from the present day, look back on and say he's making the right decision, which isn't always the easy decision, but he's making the right decision.
You never question his sincerity or his work ethic. And it takes going through some tough times politically or economically in this country to say, you know, those dependable qualities, you don't always get, and boy, you miss them when you don't have them.
That he's able in the midst of all of these challenges, all of these difficulties, to find a way,
He's all right.
In October of 1908, as it had 20 years earlier, University Park in Indianapolis was packed with onlookers, some reverential and some merely curious. This time it was to mark the unveiling of a bronze sculpture. Harrison's daughter Elizabeth did the honors. They had come from every state of the Union, but Harrison would forever be Indiana's president.
Loved of all men, choice of a nation's mighty brotherhood, her soldier, statesman, ruler, aye. But then we knew him, long before the world's applause and after, as a neighbor, kind and good, our common friend and fellow citizen. James Whitcomb Riley.
Perhaps Harrison himself had pronounced his own epitaph years before, honoring the memory of Ulysses S. Grant at Mount Gregor, New York. Great lives never go out, he said. They go on.
A President at the Crossroads is made possible through a generous grant from the Indiana Office of Tourism Development.
Thank you.